But we're all here together for this historic news. We are joined by our colleague Rachel Mattal, plus MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman, the host of MSNBC's Allin Chris Hayes, just zoomed into the studio. This is so exciting. This is your hour. Your thoughts?
I prefer it this way. Great to be with you. And Chris.
I learned when I read it that I was not getting up.
People think everything's planned.
Sorry,
this is not. So thanks for saying. I'm here with Rachel. I mean, I'll start like this. May 3rd, 2024 is a date in history. It is the conviction of a former president of the United States. That lasts. That is an indelible stain, as you quoted the New York Times put it, on him. This is a man who has been running from the long arm of the law for a very long time. This is a country that has witnessed that, and in some sense the different poles of the country have agreed on that reality and had different reactions to it. Some cheering him on. He's running for president right now in even more brazen ways against the law. Rachel was just discussing that, and he is doing that openly, talking about pardoning convicted murderers, people with federal convictions, people, of course, who committed crimes according to a jury of their peers on his behalf, but also others who committed crimes unrelated to Donald Trump. That is very much what he's running on. The long arm of the law is something he ran from until today. He's convicted on all 34 felony counts by a jury of his peers. He will be sentenced, the judge says, on July 11th, where he will, with his lawyers, face the prospect, and he may be thinking about it, Rachel, for every day from now till July 11th, the prospect that he could just be fined and get a stern warning. That's possible. Or he could get some sort of supervised home confinement. Or he could get a sentence involving incarceration, where he and his guards, under federal law, he has guards, he has protection, would have to report into a local facility, Rikers Island, or it could be a different New York facility where he would serve time. So that's where we are today. It is a very different place than where we were yesterday or 2 hours ago. And it is a matter of accountability that someone who has flouted the law and run from the law has now found the law caught up with him, and he was served this accountability today. He is now a convicted felon in his one-time home state of New York.
And he's been convicted of 34 felonies. And he is not just a former president. He is the Republican Party's nominee for president. I will go back to a point I made earlier, which is that I think the Republican Party has a decision to make now as to whether or not it is okay to be convicted of 34 felonies and still hold the nomination of that party for their presidency, for the presidency. He is the presumptive nominee. He is not the official nominee of that party. They can choose somebody else at this point. And if these felony convictions mean what they have always meant for everybody else in U.S. history who has encountered the criminal justice system while they were also standing for political office, the Republican Party will take that seriously and may reconsider that matter. But
can I ask you a question about that, though?
Please.
I mean, on that, this trial was about, its hinge point was the release of the Access Hollywood tape, which was the last time they sort of went, do we want to do this? And they said yes.
Yeah.
So what are your...
Well, I've been thinking about that because I sort of, once I absorbed the sort of shock of the unanimous 34 guilty verdicts, the next thing I started to think about was the closing from Joshua Steinglass, the prosecutor. Because in his closing, I just pulled this part of the transcript, he said to the jury, I suggest to you that the value of this corrupt bargain forged at this Trump Tower meeting, which was the meeting where they set up the catch and kill scheme, cannot be overstated. It turned out to be one of the most valuable contributions anyone ever made to the Trump campaign. When you put all of these components together, this scheme cooked up by these men at this time could very well be what got President Trump elected. Hearing that, the jury then went into the jury room, deliberated, and decided on all 34 counts we are going to find him guilty. The case put to them by the prosecution was that Donald Trump likely became president in the first place because of these dozens of felonies he committed in order to defraud the public, in order to get elected.
And I just want to say something about the jury here, because there's a writer I really love, Osito Onevu, and he's made this point before. He said, when you take a step back, the only people that have held Donald Trump truly accountable have been ordinary people. They didn't vote for him the first time around. They kicked him out of office the second time around. And in two different juries, random folks, literally off the street, more or less, drawn from a machine that's popping out numbers and addresses in a civil trial and in this trial, came together, reasoned with each other as equal citizens, and said, Yeah, he did it. The whole time we've been lectured about how, like, you don't understand Trump's appeal, and that it's that he's really the tribune of the vote of the people, and you elites and liberals. No. People, real people, our fellow citizens at every hinge point, important hinge point, have rejected the man, or in this case, found him plainly guilty of the thing that he plainly did.
Why? Why do you think?
I just have a lot of faith in people, and I think that I mean, and again, I think that, I don't want to overstate the case. Bad people can be elected. It's not like some foolproof system, and juries can return wrong verdicts, and we've seen that. I don't want to one of the things I think is tricky in our discussion of this is not to paint the majesty of the law.
Right, don't follow the moment out the window.
Yeah, it's a complicated and often remorseless system that we have constructed here in America of criminal justice.
But would you say that's true for rich white people?
No, generally it is not.
With three experienced defense counsel?
That's the other thing. I said this on my show last night, and I really felt it and stood by today as we were preparing the jury, is, to me, the process was itself a monumental achievement. Whatever happened today, the process was an achievement. Everyone in that room, again, as equals, in this municipal building, with these career prosecutors, and this judge, and this jury of average citizens, testing the principle of equal justice under law. Can we just take this process that we use on other people all the time and apply it to this individual? And whatever happened today in that outcome of the jury, that process worked. It would have worked in a hung jury. I really believe that, truly. That the process was its own achievement.
And it was different than your average case because every single human being involved in that process was subjected to threat and intimidation, including threats to their family, by virtue of the fact that they were in there. And they still carried this through to the end.
Yeah, and it's something we've all covered is regular people who interact with regular jobs in society, and particularly in marginalized communities, don't have this impression that you could never get in trouble, and there's never cases like this, right? Not every case is a capital murder case. This was not the most serious case on the books, but it was also not nothing.
Yeah.
And, we're here talking about this. I mean, I'm not going to read them all, but we have. If you print out all of the New York cases, business record cases, they go on and on and on. The fact that some people who are uninformed, elite, out of touch, or otherwise don't think anyone should ever get in trouble, because no one in their experience gets in trouble, and there's two types of information. There's experience and there's knowledge. Right. And their personal experience may be, you don't get in trouble for lying on your taxes. No, you don't get in trouble. Right. You're projecting.
Correct.
Some people go to, now, it's not always the first thing, to be legally clear. If you have an honest mistake on your taxes, it doesn't usually immediately involve incarceration. If you have an ongoing multi-year tax scheme or you've been warned by your lawyers or accountants, it can. And in these business fraud cases, many people have been tried and convicted. And so what happened today is that conviction on that kind of case. Another technical point I haven't made yet, but we have Andrew here, and it is 6 p.m. on the East Coast, so let's make it.
Yeah, you go, boy.
This is your time.
They got here through this process, as we've all said. And had it taken longer, that would have been okay. And had it been a hung jury, that would have been okay. And had they deadlocked and been encouraged to keep deliberating, that would have been okay. But let's observe, they didn't. So they never got to a point where they said, after several days, we really are torn. It's tough. What do we do? And in that case, there are strict rules for fairness to the defendant. The judge can't just say, you're not leaving until you agree, which can lead to a conviction. There are written rules. Generally it's called an Allin charge. New York has its version of it. This is regulated. It can be reviewed on appeal. They never even got to that point. And so I would observe that had they gotten to that point, it would be legal, normal, and okay. But it wasn't even that close a call.
Yeah.
And again, that's with a jury that included
But they also didn't go away for 5 minutes. They went away for hours and slept on it for a night and worked on it for hours and hours and sent notes and asked questions and had stuff reviewed.
Thorough.
I mean, it would have also, I think, people would have judged the jury, forgive the phrase, had they gone away and 7 minutes later come back and turn it around. But they clearly engaged substantively with the matter.
Right, and as you've pointed out many times, other politicians have been held to account in both directions. Governor Blagojevich was a Democrat.
Yeah. He
was held to account. The state government of Illinois did not fall apart because he was patrolled for trying to sell a Senate seat through a bribe. That was a good thing, not a bad thing. And then he was convicted. John Edwards was tried on a different, murkier case by Jack Smith, by the way, and it took weeks and they deadlocked, right? So you can't have a deadlock, and we would be covering that. If they deadlocked to the point of a hung jury, we would be covering that. But I do think, again, our job is to observe it and report it. So notwithstanding what other people might say regardless, because they're not following it, legally I would report that this went thorough, detailed, but didn't take an extraordinarily or unusually long time because they went through 34 counts and found 34 felony counts.
And the thing that I said when I was sitting here the other night, which is the summation was, maybe this is exactly what it looks like.
Yes.
Right.
I think carried the day. I mean, again, it is a little bit, and I really sort of put myself in the posture of not second-guessing the jury, whatever they returned, because they were in that room and I wasn't, right? They heard the case and I didn't. I will say, though, there is a little bit of those occasional gravity exists moments you have over the last 9 years where you go through periods where, like, does gravity exist? Is Herschel Walker a good Senate candidate? Like, have I lost my mind? Is Herschel Walker a good Senate candidate?
Is child labor law a real problem in the American market?
And it's like, oh, no, Herschel Walker's a bad Senate candidate. You're not crazy. And, again, following the case as close as we all did, again, it's not a case like anything that I've ever reported on. I've reported on criminal cases before, but it certainly looked like they had the goods on him and they presented a good case and they had the paper trail. And in the end, to have them deliberate as they did and come back with this, there's something just... I don't know.
It's nice when we can believe our eyes and our ears.
That's right, yes.
Right?
Like,
what I thought was notable was that Trump's side seemed to be asking the jury to do what Trump asked his voters to do, which was don't believe what you see, don't believe what you hear, just believe me, and they didn't do that. Can we bring our colleague Katie Tur in?
Let's do it.
You do it.
You want me to do it?
You do it.
Katie Tur was actually inside the courthouse today when the verdict was read. We eagerly await her reporting. Katie, go ahead.
You know, I was inside the overflow room when the verdict was read. I wanted to be able to see this moment with my own eyes. In about 3 weeks from today, I will have been covering Donald Trump for 9 years. There will not have been a day in the past 9 years, I think, where I have not mentioned his name or at least thought a thought about Donald Trump. I was there at the time that this trial is regarding the Access Hollywood tape, the Stormy Daniels payment. I covered the fallout from the Access Hollywood tape. I understood what the prosecution was trying to argue when they were talking about intent and the desire to conceal the Stormy Daniels payment, because what the campaign was going through in those moments when the campaign was falling apart, when Republicans were abandoning him, when his own campaign staff was abandoning him, when Senator Mike Lee was crying in a selfie video saying he could never possibly support a man who said such things. I've been, and you guys have too, the last 9 years we've been living with the consequence of reporting on Donald Trump and everything that comes with that, the good and frequently the bad. And so today, when I was watching Donald Trump's face as the verdict was read, and I was watching as the jury filed out in front of him, I was struck by how not a single one of them, from my vantage point, looked at his face. They either looked straight ahead or they looked down as they passed by him. I never saw a juror look directly in his eyes. And you have to imagine now what those jurors have to wonder what they must be feeling. The weight of getting up and knowing that you have to make this decision alone, how heavy that must have been to get out of bed and to understand that a decision that you make could change the course of American history. Who knows how it's going to affect the election, but a decision you make will have some effect. And now to live with that decision and live with the consequences that might come with it. I don't know what Judge Mershon said to the jury behind closed doors. He was going to have a meeting with them to thank them. But I wonder if he did what Judge Kaplan did in the E. Jean Carroll case, which is to tell the jurors that it's probably not a good idea to talk to us reporters and the press. Yes, obviously we want to understand what was happening in that jury deliberation room. I'd love to hear the thinking. I'd love to understand who thought what about the underlying felonies and the intent. But at the same time, it is completely understandable to think that these jurors would never want to talk to us, would never want their identities released, because to have that information out there subjects them to a world of ugliness and potentially a world of violence. We live in such a tense time and such an angry time that I think about what the jurors were feeling when they passed by his table. When it comes to Donald Trump himself, I wanted, again, to see his face as this was read, because this is a moment in history, and this is a man who's not faced consequences for his actions for most of his life. He's been facing a series of them recently in court cases that he has no control over, by the way. He was stone cold, didn't react whatsoever. There was no raise of the eyebrows, there was no shrug, there was no reaction. He sat there looking at the jury, looking at each one of them as they passed by, but never made a move, never muttered anything, never changed his expression. He looked almost deflated from my experience with him. But what a moment in history, and what an experience to see this happen in real time, and to understand that Donald Trump, this man who has lived his life basically consequence-free, was elected president despite everything that happened in 2016, is now running again, now faces the consequences of being held to account in a jury, held to account, found guilty of multiple felonies by a jury of his peers here in Manhattan.
Katie Tur, putting it in perspective and reporting live from that courthouse in Manhattan where his fate was sealed by the jury. Thank you so much. We want to bring in the former acting U.S. Solicitor General of the United States, Neil Katyal, part of our special coverage, here with Rachel, Nicole, Chris, and Andrew. Neil, May 30th, 2024, Donald J. Trump convicted on 34 felony counts. What does this verdict mean?
So, Ari, I think about it in three words: 34 for 45. 34 counts convicted for the 45th former president of the United States. It's never happened before in our history. And these are felony counts. These aren't slaps on the wrist. They're not misdemeanors. These are not minor things. As the prosecutor Steinglass said to the jury in his closing, Donald Trump may have been elected president because of these crimes, because of his hiding of these campaign contributions. And, you know, Rachel has talked eloquently about the political implications. I don't understand that. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you what this means about the rule of law. I mean, my parents came here to this country precisely because of jury verdicts like this, because of the idea that no one is above the law, that a jury of one's peers can hold someone to account no matter who you are. And this jury has now decided that. And Ari, I think the most important point is they decided that against, and Trump was guilty, against the most difficult standard for the prosecution to show in all of American law. They had to show it beyond a reasonable doubt. They had to win all 12 jurors. One juror saying Trump didn't do it was enough for him not to be convicted. I know how hard that is. I did that in the George Floyd murder with my team. You know, that's a scary standard, you know, to do. But here it was met as it was in the Floyd case. And, you know, that's such a tough standard, Ari. It's like, you know, it's kind of like failing kindergarten. If you're a jury facing a jury trial, you got to kind of try to fail a jury trial if you're a criminal defendant. You got everything going for you. And yet Trump managed to do that. Yeah. And I think the last thing I just say is Chris Hayes' point about the faith in the system is right. I mean, that, you know, I think this shows that the system works, but I suspect Trump's next move will be, as it always is, to denigrate the system, to attack the institutions, to attack the prosecution, to attack the jury system. And so don't pop our champagne corks yet, because Trump's going to run against this system. And our job as lawyers is to make sure that people understand how that system works and how justice was done today.
Neil Katyal weighing in here for the first time, and we appreciate you making time to do that. Thank you. We're back with our full panel. Neil mentioned what Chris had said, and as well, Nicole, you think about we're moments away from Alvin Bragg, the DA who brought this case. It was going to be controversial, probably either way. I would note, if his name is not super familiar, if you're watching and can't even conjure exactly what he looks like, that is because he has followed the Jack Smith playbook and the Bob Mueller playbook before that. DA Bragg spoke once regarding this case. It was when they announced the prosecution, and it was very spare. So spare, I'll remind people, he was criticized at the time for not elaborating further about the theory, about the campaign aspects, things that we then later learned about in detail in court, where he let his team, the assistant DAs, do the talking. And so we're scheduled to hear from him moments away. They released one tweet, which you read earlier, where they said guilty on all counts. Very businesslike. But this will be the first time we hear from this DA who's let the evidence and his team do the talking.
I mean, he's been underestimated. You've interviewed him. I think you've interviewed him as well. And to talk to him, he wants to talk to you about other things. He's not, Donald Trump relies on and projects onto everyone else what is inside of him. And what's inside of him is a possessed and obsessed partisan actor. Alvin Bragg just doesn't fit the mold. I mean, he did this because the facts and the law supported this. Again, not in a timeline that a lot of his supporters and detractors would have liked. I think some people would have liked to have seen the case that Pomerantz had investigated go to trial much sooner than Alvin Bragg brought it. But he was convinced. I think there was some reverse engineering, and I say that not as a lawyer, of the Michael Cohen account. There seemed to be meticulous corroboration if you read every transcript and if you looked at every witness. And I think that it's a little more clear, and we'll hear from him himself, that maybe that was what he was doing.
Yeah. I mean, the Alvin Bragg achievement here, Andrew, before we got the jury's verdict, you were saying if there is one guilty verdict among these 34 counts, that is a victory for the prosecution. That counts as a conviction, and that is what the prosecution is aiming for. When it came in as all 34, that's obviously something more than a victory for the prosecution. It's a vindication of their approach. And their approach here was methodical. Obviously, we saw what the defense's approach was, which was Michael Cohen is a bad man. We saw what the prosecution's handling was of that criticism, which was everything that Michael Cohen is going to tell you is as a narrator of the evidence, essentially. But we're also going to show you the evidence. They had smoking gun documentation of the crimes that they needed to prove.
So what people are going to hear from Alvin Bragg, and it's sort of good background from my friends in law enforcement who have known him for years as a federal prosecutor, as a state prosecutor. The word on Alvin Bragg is he is the real deal.
Yeah.
Not meaning that he's Torquemada and he's like, I'm going to go out hammer and tongs on everyone, meaning he is a professional who is principled. And that when he said the case wasn't ready, it was because the case wasn't ready. And when he decided to bring the case, it was because he decided the case was ready. In other words, it's like what you see is what you get. There's no backstory. It is like this was a guy who's known as the real deal. And then he handled himself that way. Without casting any aspersions on any other way anyone else acts, he did this sort of classic model of I'm going to speak in court. And this verdict is what he's speaking out through. And now is the time for him to say something about his team. And the one thing everyone saw that when you were in court was this was the A-team. Yeah. I mean, it was a stupendous presentation.
So can we newsify it a little bit? Do you expect him to take questions? Do you think he'll speak to sentencing on what they're requesting or make any news tonight like that?
I don't think he'll talk about sentencing. I think that they're going to think long and hard about what to do. I do expect that, I mean, not to tout myself on the back, but I do think the things that I said that are factors are going to be brought up to the court. It is, by the way, it's an E felony, so it is not the most serious felony under state law, but it is hard to think of an E felony that is more serious in terms of the underlying facts. And that is something that Judge Merchan is so experienced, has been a judge for so long, that cannot escape him.
Can I jump in here just for a second? For anybody who might just be joining us, you just skipped over sort of an important point that we discussed there earlier, and I want to make sure we resurface that. The next thing that's going to happen here in court is that there's going to be, both sides are going to submit their advice to the judge, essentially their arguments to the judge as to what the sentencing should be. The sentencing is scheduled for July 11th at 10 a.m. You mentioned earlier, Andrew, that one of the things Judge Merchan might reasonably consider factor when he is making a decision on sentence is the fact that Trump multiply violated the gag order in this case. Right. And that is allowed to influence the judge's perception in terms of what kind of sentence is warranted here. My question is the gag order still in effect? Does the gag order stay in effect until sentencing, or is it now over because the trial itself is over?
So that's interesting because, one of the things that it focuses on is witnesses and jurors.
And jurors, right.
So I think with respect to jurors, it'll be interesting to see whether the judge says something and clarifies, because that is going to be needed going forward.
Protecting the jurors.
Absolutely. And also, just to be fair, with witnesses, it is, as the judge said, he is concerned not just about the individual person right in front of him, but about the next person. And so if you are concerned about witnesses writ large and jurors writ large, you want to make sure that they are protected and they don't feel secure. I mean, it is, by the way, it is still surreal having this question about somebody who is president of the United States. This is the kind of conversation.
Mob talk.
Exactly. Having done organized crime cases, you do not. This is beyond mob talk.
They're rational actors, right?
Exactly. This is something you worry about to a certain extent. That is why there's the Witness Protection Program. You would not worry about it at this point,
and
but you are.
More than having done, you were Eastern District. You guys do more mafia cases than most any district in the country.
True.
So as we await here, we're 90 seconds out from when D.A. Bragg may speak, or maybe a little delayed. Andrew was talking to Rachel about what could happen in this July sentencing hearing, and you mentioned witnesses. We also have fresh reporting out of the courtroom today. The last thing that happened after the jury was polled and after the judge made his closing remarks, and that's really completing it, was the defense, having seen their defendant convicted on all 34 counts, made one final push requesting an acquittal motion, and they based that on attacking Michael Cohen, who proved to be a good enough witness. Not a perfect witness, but clearly good enough. I mentioned we're going to hear from D.A. Bragg. We're also scheduled here. It's news, but will be interesting to hear from Michael Cohen tonight on MSNBC, the first place I believe he'll be speaking since the verdict. But Andrew, can you speak on that and how they are still going to launch this appeal strategy going at Cohen, while the sentencing could be harsher if they view his other attacks on witnesses as part of aggravating factors?
Well, it'll be interesting. I think the timing of the sentencing and the appeal is going to be very much what I would say, Nicole, as I say, in your lane. It'll be in the politics lane in terms of what they think may happen on appeal and whether they think that is something that will benefit them. If they think that it will be useful to have an appellate brief in before the election so that they can get some lackeys to say, oh, yes, this is there's tons of legal error here, they will do that. But for the moment, there will be a sentencing. There is no question that the judge is going to, no matter what sentence it is, I have to say this is in front of a judge, and I felt this way when I went to a sentencing that Amy Berman Jackson, who had the Manafort case and the Rick Gates case, where I had my own view as to what I thought should happen. And sometimes you're in front of a judge that you respect so much and think is so thoughtful that you really think whatever he does is actually going to be fair. It may not be exactly what you would do, but this is one where we have seen a judge who has just done an incredible job getting the case to trial. Not being able to put this person, having to put the person in jail, trying to make sure that there was a fair process. And so the sentencing, I think, will be fascinating. But I do expect that there will obviously we know what Donald Trump will argue, that he will argue that he should get no time. I think the state will argue that there should be some time and cite many of these factors, including, just to be clear, the gag order violations, essentially things that go to lack of remorse and recidivism.
Right.
And this is, again, a sort of a poster child for somebody doing that. And so the next sort of, I think, big news cycle on this case is going to be that sentencing and the judge's comments, because now the judges is so interesting. They go from being completely fair and impartial, but then they get to have a view at the time of sentencing as to what they think this means.
And there's also, I mean, the behavior of this defendant, and Catherine Christian had this line to me when I asked her, like, have you ever seen this? And she said, only in cases of like acute mental illness. Like only in the case of a defendant with like some deep problem with their sort of regulation and functioning have I seen a defendant attack people like this. It's the only in my 30 years that I practice in courts. There's an Occam's razor reason why you don't do that, right? Like it doesn't make a lot of sense to go after the judge and the judge's daughter and to rain down like calumny on her when that person is sitting in judgment of you. It's not like rocket science. You don't need a law degree to understand why you might not want to do that. But I have to just say,
it's like fighting with the bouncer.
Yes, exactly.
You're not going to get in.
It's fighting with the bouncer. Here, you know,
Nicole, you get
and you're going to lose.
You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking that when you take out your camera and you film someone that's it never works. They don't care. They wouldn't be yelling at you in public if they fighting with the bouncer.
And also, I just got to say, I mean, one of the most striking things to me, probably the most striking aspect of being in that courtroom was Judge Merchan's temperament, was his just absolute control of the courtroom and his absolute equanimity and the degree to which it just sort of exuded this sort of paragon of like judicial temperament. And in the end, judging is a very human undertaking that requires good judgment. And we've seen a lot of judges acting, I think, with very questionable judgment recently. And I just think you cannot say enough about the temperament and the way that he has conducted this entire
But the skill in keeping control of the courtroom as well. There were we're all talking about these are protesters. Are these This is outside the courthouse. I thought they were at Trump Tower before, but this is outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. We did also see, we had a live shot moments ago of Trump himself outside Trump Tower. So that's in Midtown Manhattan, 50 or so blocks north of that, where he was making those sort of weird, suggestive fist hand things that he does, which I don't think is a good idea. But he was doing that outside, apparently to no people outside Trump Tower. The crowd seemed to be anti-Trump protesters right now. But on the point of Judge Merchan, you not only have to have the right temperament, you have to do the right things. And even though we're talking about him as being very even-keeled, there were moments when he snapped to attention, raised his voice, cleared the courtroom, called something out of bounds, shut it down. And that is a skill set that you need that is more than just do you have good judgment and do you have a good temperament to be able to do these things? He's an experienced judge who knew how to take care of a courtroom where there were agents of chaos there. I mean, bringing lots of felons into the front few rows of the court to sit there with the former president while they were trying to break the rules in terms of using their phone, while they were trying to show off that they didn't need to be cleared from the courtroom, while they were pretending like they were part of the defense team. I mean, people who are ex-cons, that's something that you do in order to change the temperament, to change the temperature in that courtroom. And he held control of it.
And 2 points on that. One is small. I remember sitting in the courtroom, and defendants and lawyers always come back on time in a criminal case. I mean, that's part of what Chris was just saying. And there was a day where they'd come back quite late, so it made a show of the judge, of all people, having to wait for the criminal defendant. And he very calmly said to the lawyers, please don't repeat this because I will have to make a larger thing out of it. The jury wasn't there yet. He said, and I don't want to do that in fairness to you. And he dealt with that very calmly and fairly. But second, to the larger point that you're all gesturing to, Donald Trump habitually, constantly tests everything. And so if you divide it very simply, if we cleave it to people and the system, what you said earlier and what we've all been discussing, marveling at, the jury of his peers, the many witnesses and others who went through this, including that above average attacks, the people have comported themselves really well, and that's why this is an important part of the process. The system has had holes poked in it in the same way that a small child's temper tantrum can poke holes in the restaurant's system, even though they haven't memorized how the restaurant works. But they figured out how to bring the restaurant to a halt. And so the system, when you go to tactics at the Supreme Court, the way he's worked the federal system, it's not like he knows more about this than Jack Smith. But like the toddler's chaos, some of that has worked, but the people have stood up against that.
Let me ask you this. I mean, I think that what he would have learned from this would have been a mandate that probably wouldn't have been true, but he would have taken it with him anyway. The abusive tactics backfired spectacularly. I mean, Costello and the Judge Merchan's were giving him the side eye and staring him down, were how Merchan described it. I wasn't there. But that was how he described the conduct. And then clearing the jury out to rebuke the one witness. I mean, just tell me if there's anything you can deduce or extrapolate from how the jury might have experienced those things.
I think it's a great question. I think juries can pick up the atmosphere. They can pick up a general baseline of how the teams are operating, who is being fair and respectful, and that comes in at the margins. It shouldn't reverse the evidence. But when you talk about credibility, for example, and I think we're watching some footage here of where we expect the DA to speak, so we'll cut to that the moment he hits the podium.
Got 8 minutes.
But the key there is when you have, for example, one of the only breakthroughs that the defense had for Trump, where they did raise the legitimate question of, if Michael Cohen described that one big call to Donald Trump's bodyguard as the key moment, but misremembered or misstated aspects of it, which was a fair claim, do you believe the lawyer? Do you find that credible? Or does this run of a piece with a bunch of other stuff that was spun and exaggerated and overdone? That's where it might matter. That's where the credibility comes in, and the relationship you have with the judge over those days can matter, and I don't think that worked. And then the second point on the chaos agent is the chaos has worked in certain ways where we say it has been effective, right? But this courtroom, because the judge kept it running and because there weren't Supreme Court appointees from Donald Trump there to interfere, he couldn't run out the clock, and he couldn't.
How it works is you got a 98% offset, okay? There's big gaps here is when you're selling a whole bunch of electricity back to the utility company.